Good afternoon. I am Carleen Griffith-Sekou. I am a lead organizer with Black Lives Matter Boston and the Movement for Black Lives, as well as a doctoral student here in the religion, gender, and culture area. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you this afternoon to our wonderful conference, Decolonizing Feminism, Transnational Solidarity for Gender and Racial Equality. I would also like to acknowledge our partners and the folk who have helped us to make this happen. And first, I would like to thank the Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights and the Central European University Romani Studies Program in partnership, again, with Black Lives Matter Boston and the Black Student Union here at Harvard University, and to Margareta Matache, who is my co-organizer, as well as the Department of Religion, Gender, and Culture here at, in the Committee on Religion at Harvard University. So that is my initial role. Welcome to each of you, and we will move forward, and I will introduce Angela Coetzee from the Central European University, one of our partner organizers. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Central European University Romani Studies Program, and we are really privileged, really honored to have this quite unique roundtable discussion today on decolonizing feminism. Maybe some of you know that today is April 8th, the International Romani Day, and what a celebration with Black feminists, Dalit feminists, Palestinian feminists, Muslim feminists, whoever feel, connected to our struggles. And the International Romani Days, April 8th, actually, it's about celebrating Roma, celebrating the Roma civil rights movement, celebrating Romani activists who are fighting for the integration and the well-being of Romani people and the liberation of Romani people, not just in Europe, but in many other areas as well. And our founding fathers and founding mothers of the Romani civil rights movement, they came together in 1971 to actually construct the International Romani Days, as well as embark the Romani Day with the anthem and with all kinds of symbols. And I have a feeling that in 2019, having this panel, having this symposium on decolonizing feminism, transnational solidarity for gender and racial equality, that we are actually paving the way, creating a history, making a history on transnational solidarity, and at Harvard, in the epicenter of the knowledge making, knowledge production. And I'm really, really grateful for our speakers. And just a few words about the event, actually, which was evolved around the book, which is called The Romani Women's Movement, Struggles and Debates in Central Eastern Europe, which is a quite historical book. And around the book, we thought that it would be really interesting to bring together our sisters, brothers, who are sharing some kinds of common threats, common struggles with us. And we call it Decolonizing Feminism, because our goal is to interconnect perspectives, expressions, thoughts, struggles, processes, and practices of decoloniality that are really emerging in and from different corners of the globe. And we had already a discussion in this afternoon, which was very inspiring and very vivid. And I wish us a very fruitful discussion for today. And let's celebrate together the International Romani Day. Thank you.
Tavez Baktalo, Budbak, Taisastipen. Happy International Romani Day. It feels good to speak in my own language at Harvard once in a while. I don't have that forum too often. My name is Margareta Matache, and I'm going to chair this panel. I'm the director of the Roma program at Harvard FXB Center. I'm really honored to be among these brilliant women and to get a chance to listen to the next panel. As Angela mentioned, 48 years ago, Romani activists and their allies, non-Romani allies, gathered in London in a school, actually, where they put together their minds and their souls and came up with the symbols of our nationhood, if you want. A beautiful anthem and a sad anthem that tells the story of the history of our, sorrow and suffering, that is called Gelem Gelem. An item that links our people to our roots in India, but also they said a big no to the use of the racial slur gypsy, which you may be much more aware of. At this gathering, as you may imagine, there were many men, a few women too, but it is fair to say that back then, we didn't really have a strong voice, and it was the beginning of a movement that was paving their way based on the resistance and the protest of others before them who were resisting against the Nazis regime, who were resisting against the slavery in Romania. So it was a momentum for them to speak up. But then another momentum was built, and this was the Romani feminist movement. And I was very lucky at the beginning of the 90s as a child to be around one of the mothers of the Romani feminist movement in Romania, Nicoletta Beets. The other mother of the feminist thought, Romani feminist thought, it happens to be here, Alexandra Opra, and she's 24. She's still 24. She wants us to know that, but these two women really, paved the way for us to understand better what the Romani feminist thought meant. And I'm really grateful to them because I thought of myself as not being a feminist while reading white feminist thought in Romania, and it just felt that I could not find myself in that narrative, and it was them who, opened the door for a new language, a new understanding of what feminism is. But then across, Europe and the world, there were other people who were thinking about this movement too, and Angela Kotzer was in Hungary. Debra was in the US, helping us to create a conversation among feminists. So I'm grateful to be here with them today, and I'm grateful to start this conversation by discussing a book that looks at the history of the Romani feminist movement in Europe. And we also think that this conversation about Romani women would set somehow the basis for the following panel, which will look at solidarity between different movements, different struggles, and I think it's useful in the American context to learn a little bit about Romani people, as I assume that some of you here in the room don't know much about it. So I'm going to start the panel by asking a few questions, and I will ask the panelists to briefly answer to to those questions, but I know that you may have your own ideas and thoughts and questions as well. So we want to have this panel structured more as a conversation. So I will give you the floor as well. So let me start with a book first, and ask all of you here on the panel. By the way, you have their bios in the folder or in the document that we printed for you. So I'm not going to read their bios in order to save some time. So I'm just going to start with a question about the Romani women's movement. Alexandra, Oprah, what is this book about, and what did you write about it?
I don't know if I prepared for that question, but I guess we should start by saying that most of the work about Roma has not been written by Roma, and Romani women's rights has not been that different. So to have a book that includes our stories as told by us and our allies is really just monumental, and it's really expensive, the book, so I can't urge you to pick it up necessarily, but have your libraries order it, because it's really made history, and the words in that book are a deviation from the norm, and they're blood, sweat, and tears in that book. So I wanted to talk about a little bit about the early days of the Romani women's movement when we were confronting these unidimensional understandings of oppression in various political spheres. But in reality, we were experiencing these interlocking systems of oppression in our daily lives, intersectionality and intersectional subordination, in the words of Black feminists. So I wanted to start by mentioning a conference I attended in 2002. Was just 2 years old. It's a shame. I gotta keep talking about the age because I'm just. Southern Illinois University Public Policy Institute had a symposium that was called "Addressing the Plight of the Romani People." So imagine my excitement. It's 2002. Roma are hardly ever discussed in the United States, and here we were, the topic of conversation. And I don't know if anyone knows the former Senator Paul Simon, the bow tie. Mm-hmm. He was there. He was, I think. There was another famous gentleman there. So we had a roundtable discussing Roma, and we had all the big heavyweights in the Romani movement. We had Ian Hancock and Ronald Lee and various folks. And of course, I and some Macedonian Romani women, Sonia and her family, wanted to talk about addressing domestic violence as an issue that the Romani community was struggling with. And at one point, so I recommended that we included in some recommendation for the Department of Justice Violence Against Women Office to initiate outreach into Romani communities. And Matt Sallow, a gentleman who was part of the Gypsy Lore Society, one of the folks who studies gypsies, who studied us, he was at the table. And he said to me, I was the only woman on the panel, and I was really young and quite shy and easily intimidated. And he says, "What does domestic violence have to do with Roma?" And of course, I turned bright red. And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, what am I going to do?" I was like, "Wait a minute, what do you?" He's like, "Well, I've never seen Roma beating their wives." And I was like, "Well, then it must not happen. If you have not seen it, it must not happen." And so then we had a really beautiful intervention from the audience, from Macedonian Romani feminists, Sonia Yasharovska, Sadet, and her sisters. And they're like, "Yeah, it happens. Yeah, we're victimized." And it was sort of a beautiful moment of us talking back and intervening in this discourse, because Romani rights had historically been painted as, or Romani issues had historically been painted as, ones of Holocaust compensation, slavery, employment discrimination in healthcare, and then you had women's issues, translated as white women's issues, domestic violence, which were sort of off limits to us, and anytime we tried to talk about it, we were painted as traitors. and airing our dirty laundry to white folks. And being a community that was already criminalized, it was particularly difficult, right? Because one of the things you're told when you were trying to combat domestic violence, first thing is you call the police, call the police, call the police. Well, that wasn't exactly a desirable option for us because the police were the ones who were attacking Roma and killing Roma and incarcerating Roma and basically committing brutal acts against Roma, similar to the situation in the U.S. With African Americans. So we were basically, we had a lot of pushback whenever we tried to intervene, and not only in Romani discourses and feminist discourses. When we went to the Commission on the Status of Women in 2005, and Nicoletta Beets and I went to the European Women's Lobby meeting, and we said, oh, okay, great, yes, gender issues. Can we talk about police brutality? And they kind of looked at us like we were insane. Like, what does police brutality have to do with women's issues? It's not considered a woman's issue. So then there are these early parts of the movement where we're finding ourselves in positions where we're kind of asking for permission. The World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001, Romani women wanted to discuss domestic violence, coerced sterilization. They were only allowed to discuss coerced sterilization, and that was because it was framed as an affront to the race, right, as an act of genocide. So the gender dimensions were completely erased. So there's this history of us kind of requesting permission and to be included at the table and to have a voice. And then finally we just stopped asking for permission, and we just, we started organizing on our own. And I'm going to wrap it up now. And basically during this time, we really looked to Latina feminists and Black feminists to help construct our rhetoric and, reinforcing the notion, oh my gosh, okay, well, I'm not a traitor. Oh, I'm not selling out by talking about domestic violence. It's not me that's doing something wrong by shedding negative light on my community. So it was very instrumental in the beginning, of course, still is. So.
Would you like to speak for a little bit about the book?
Yes. It's wonderful to be here. I will save time and not thank everyone, but it's just been an incredible honor to be at both the Neglected Voices Conference and to be here with all of you today. I can just say, as someone who's been involved in these issues for about 20 years, it's clear that Roma women's voices are no longer neglected. From Magda's inspirational opening to the 16 women who were on various panels the other day, it's very clear that no permission is being asked to speak. But I do, as a historian, I do want to take us back a little bit to how some of these things developed. You, Magda, gave a little background about the Roma movement itself, and I had the great privilege of working with Roma women from 1998 to 2007 through the Soros Foundation Women's Program, and then the Romani Women's Initiative, which was run by 3 Romani women, Nicoletta Beets, pioneer, and my unindicted co-conspirator, who's also been mentioned, Azbia Mamedova of Macedonia, and Anisa Eminova of Macedonia, a younger woman who came on a little bit later. Very influenced by Black feminist thinking in my own life, and studying the civil rights movement and the women's movement, it was very clear to me that when I encountered these incredible women in 1998 at the dingy Hotel Astoria in Budapest, that a movement was being born. And in the very brief time that we have, I just want to articulate some principles of this initiative, which was one among several. But we really tried to operate on feminist principles. And so let's try to tease some of those out. Okay. First, as I said, the initiative was run by Romani women, the 3 that I mentioned, but also Romani women from each of the Central and Eastern European countries that we had been working with, who had already laid the groundwork and had their own networks organizationally. So bringing them together and articulating what was the most important set of issues for each group of women based on the local context. Convening meetings so that women could get together nationally, could get together regionally, and not rushing and just articulating what needed to be done from the point of view of the current moment. And there was always a tension because movement building was really our priority, but there was a lot of pressure to deliver human rights outcomes, being in a foundation that wanted to see kind of those victories. Alex mentioned the challenge of dealing with issues like coerced sterilization, and because that was an issue that spoke to the social reproduction role of Romani women, that was more acceptable to the human rights community. But some of the pioneers really took on the difficult issues of domestic violence, trafficking, LGBTQ issues early on, and say that again?
Virginity tests.
Virginity tests, yes. So Alex wrote a very pioneering article about the dangers of stereotyping Romani women around some of these issues of early marriage and virginity testing about a young woman named Anna Maria Chabo in Romania. And so running the risk of patronizing white feminist responses about airing dirty laundry in the Romani community, but Romani women kept on articulating these issues, and I would have to say that took a both and rather than an either or approach to everything. So when accused of betraying mainstream Romani issues, Roma rights agenda, refused to separate out the fight against racism and sexism. So intersectional began thinking from the beginning, and efforts, as you said, to use the European and the international mechanisms, but because they were always on separate tracks that could not integrate gender issues and race issues, it was a very challenging effort. So I'll start with.
Thank you, Magda. First of all, I'd like to say, as an ally, as a non-Romani person, it's an honor to be here. I've been involved in Romani studies and in activism for 40 years, but I'm constantly learning. And today is a fantastic time for all of us to realize we are always learning from our sisters, from our fellow warriors, from people who are marginalized, from struggles going on in places that don't seem relevant to you. There's always something you can learn. So my contribution to the book was a concluding remark. So I wanted to just emphasize how pioneering this volume is from a number of different points of view. First of all, it is the first volume to address Romani women's experience and its activism, okay? So although we didn't use the title feminism, and we'll talk about that later, we are actually talking about lived experience and how it becomes activism, whether you're an intellectual or not. That activism comes from many points and many places. Resistance is widespread, even if you don't realize it as resistance. Even living your life to the end of your life can be resilience, and you can learn how people manage to do that in the face of huge consequences. So I think the volume is amazing for its content and its breadth. Methodology. The volume goes through quite a number of different positionalities, which is really amazing to me. Women who have built the movement from the very beginning, women who have learned from other women's movements and other struggles, people who have lived in their own country for a long time and know the different communities, people who have traveled transnationally and in that movement have learned comparative feminist issues and comparative struggles, and allies as well, people who are not Roma and people who have contributed to the movement. And there's quite a lot about building coalitions, so with different positionalities. And of course, this brings me to intersectionality, okay, which is an extremely important principle of the volume. But it deals with it in some very interesting ways. First of all, wherever people are Roma, no matter if they're rich, gay, transgender, female, male, in rich countries, third world countries, wherever they are, they face oppression as Roma, okay? So that's a guiding principle. But yet, all of those positionalities that I've mentioned are different and need to be understood in their own terms. And so, of course, the gendered position of women as oppressed is the central thing, but always in conversation with the other positionalities. The volume is quite brave also in dealing with sexuality and the emerging LGBTQ movement within Romani Studies and the coalitions with other sexualities in Europe and the Americas. The other thing I wanted to talk about is culture. I'll talk about this a little later, but the volume is very sophisticated in the way that culture is not assumed to be static, not assumed to be essential, and can be transformative. Because if I say the word gypsy to you, you have images in your head no matter where you were raised, no matter how educated you are. You have internalized those stereotypes. When I teach my classes, I start with that word, and the stereotypes are very consistent, and they're extremely gendered. There's a woman with long hair and sexualized, having a lot of children, either a welfare mother or a beggar. These things are part of European history. And these are the things we have to start with to dismantle them and rebuild a movement that is based on multiple cultures and multiple ways of being human in the world. Thank you.
Hello to everybody. I'm coming from Romania. I'm among the editors of the volume. And after my colleagues' presentations, I was thinking to focus on the subtitle of the volume, which is Struggles and Debates in Central and Eastern Europe. So basically, when we are talking about Roma women's movement and or Roma feminisms, we have to be aware of the fact that we discussed about this in the context of a region which went through major political and economic transformations in the past 30 years. So it is actually the dismantlement of really existing socialism, which constitutes the larger context in which we discuss about Romani women's movement. So, and even larger, I may say, in the sense that the word was used by Nancy Fraser. We are discussing and thinking about this in a so-called post-socialist condition, right? So therefore, I guess it was so difficult, I mean, always is difficult probably, but specifically difficult in Central and Eastern Europe to articulate a movement by Roma women. Why? Because we are in a context, in a post-socialist context, when Roma started to be recognized as a national minority. They were not recognized as such before. And all issues of racism that their politics of recognition was encountered. So for Roma women, as I understood, it was very difficult, you know, to shape their own position of talking about their personal stories by making them political messages in this context. On the other hand, again, in a post-socialist condition, it was the moment when feminism was starting to redefine itself after the whole period of time of a state socialist feminism, which was supposedly doing the so-called emancipation of women. So there were these big, political and mechanisms and contexts within which Roma women had to find their place and had to basically justify that they have a different experience to share and a different political position to build. And again, if we look at the volume, we see that there are different geographies and temporalities which meet in this volume. So there are like 10 countries, like 20 authors who are talking about personal stories and big histories of the times. So I may say that this volume is an instrument for building an imagined community of people who believe in the political potential of Romani feminism. And as Carol, myself, I may say that I am an ally for Romani feminism. But also, and this might be an issue that we can discuss about, is it possible for somebody who is not a Roma to claim that is part of Romani feminism? So how we understand Romani feminism. And basically, as far as our contribution from Romania is concerned, we discussed this issue with two women comrades of mine, Letizia Marc and Carmen Gheorghe. So the title of our contribution is Towards an Anti-Racist Feminism for Social Justice. And we put this discussion in the context of Romania. And we very much believe in the political potential of Romani feminism and in the fact that Romani feminism is actually a political choice, is an intersectional politics, and is rooted in the political solidarity among women, but is also a struggle for a better world which is free of not only racism and patriarchy, but also free of class exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I feel very tempted to continue this conversation about the book, especially because there is also a critique in the book. So it's not that the feminists that wrote this volume come together with the same voice, but there is also a very interesting critique, I think, that Yelena is putting on the way that Romani feminism is being constructed. But I'm mindful of the fact that in the audience we have people who don't know much about the Roma. So in view of building that understanding, my next question would refer to that. And I think that the book, but also us, kind of know that for centuries the bodies of Romani women have been targeted by state-sponsored violence and hatred. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of these instances, but also the responses and the tactics that Romani women and Romani feminists have been using in order to address structural discrimination and racism. And I leave it up to you to decide who's going to go first. You want to start?
Hi. As a non-Romani anti-racist feminist and witness, I am heeding Alex's call to tell you about a project that we really think is exemplary, created by young Romani men and women, initially in Macedonia and then spread to about 10 countries, a participatory action research project where young people went around and conducted interviews with young Romani men, young Romani women, and parents, really interrogating the question of whether this idea of virginity before marriage was something that was serving the community, because that's the cultural stereotype across Europe, and also the stereotype that can be potentially dangerously exploited by patronizing white feminists. So this was an incredibly successful project where it was revealed that communities were really willing to engage in dialogue, and even people who are quite traditional in their approach to these issues were willing to listen to the young people, actually, and document the responses and share this as a public education campaign in about 10 countries. So I was going to say in my initial response to the question that one way of fighting back against state-sponsored violence and racism was to have Romani women create their own knowledge. So the Virginity Project was one example. There were many others.
So in case you guys don't know what that refers to, and it's expected that a Romani woman is a virgin when she gets married, and some groups have particular tests that they administer to ensure that that is the case, and it affects obviously how you're going to, it affects the dowry if there's one involved in that particular community, it affects how you are going to be treated by your in-laws. You know, sometimes it could lead to a cris, which is a court case where they want to give the bride back if she's not a virgin. So, and you know, it has very real physical invasive consequences, whether you are or aren't one. So the probing into that itself, and then the consequences if you aren't. So the fact that, you know, when I heard that Enisa was taking on this project with the help of the Roma Women's Initiative, it's pretty revolutionary. I can only imagine the kind of backlash she faced on the ground, because not only do you not, you know, combat this sort of thing, you don't mention it around non-Roma. You don't tell them about it. You don't talk about this kind of thing in general and put that laundry out there, which is a whole different brand of laundry. So I can only imagine what Enisa was going through on the ground doing this work. I guess I'll talk about coerced sterilization, which I'm not sure many of you know, but in the area now, well, it was formerly Czechoslovakia. There's been several cases in the European Court of Human Rights of Romani women being sterilized against their will. So for instance, they'll go in and they're more likely to be subject to C-sections, and during the procedure, sometimes they're asked while they're in labor and in pain, they're asked to sign a piece of paper that they can't read anyway. And in this compromising position, they're asked, sometimes someone signs for them or guides their hand, or sometimes they're not told at all. And when they wake up from the procedure, they're no longer able to have children. So I think the last documented case that we know of was in, I want to say 2008, 2009, which doesn't mean that that's the last time it happened, obviously. And we do know that there are reports, and I think Yelena is going to talk about this a bit also, there are reports of segregated maternity wards in various countries, more recently in Slovakia, where literally Romani women cannot use the same toilets as pregnant white women, they cannot use the same dining facilities, and they're not housed in the same accommodations, their bed sheets aren't changed. You have, you know, sort of pristine and clean facilities for white women, and then the Romani women are forced to sort of endure vile conditions, and not only that, but brutality at the hands of the doctors and women who are, a report came out in case you're interested, coercive and cruel. I think it was by the ERRC in 2018, that documents basically the brutality that these women are subject to when they go to give birth. And of course, it's related to all the rhetoric around Romani women, you know, having too many kids, right, and becoming welfare queens and being bad gypsy mothers who, you know, put their children to beg and maim their kids in order to collect state benefits. And it's related to that type of rhetoric. So there are these segregated conditions in the maternity wards, and the brutality that they're faced, where they're slapped or cursed at or told, hey, you weren't crying like this when you made the baby, so don't cry now, that kind of treatment. And when presented with this type of evidence, the European Court of Human Rights, on the one hand, they did recognize that Romani women were discriminated against, and I think they found in favor of Articles 3 and 8, which is the against torture and discrimination based on private family life, but they didn't find an Article 14 violation, which is essentially discrimination. They didn't find that there was a discriminatory, that there was discrimination at the heart of the coercive sterilization of Romani women. And in part, it's based on the court's general lack of willingness to recognize Article 14 discrimination in general, because racism and sexism is sort of something over there and aberrational as opposed to part of everyday life. It's in part that, but it's also in part because these women's experiences don't fit neatly into gender discrimination or race discrimination. It's sort of sui generis, sui generis? It's different, okay? It's both race and gender. So the court was unwilling to recognize. So when you think about it, in the area Czechoslovakia had, I think since the 70s, or no, was it earlier? I'm not a historian here, because since the 70s they had sterilization laws, and they offered financial incentives to Roma women to get sterilized, and there was sort of a plan in place, unwritten, but it was known amongst politicians that the financial incentives at the very least were aimed at curbing the Romani population, and it was sort of like, how do we get the gypsies to want to get sterilized? Offer them money. So there are these, the court was presented with a whole plethora of evidence, including the historical targeting of Roma for sterilization, the segregated maternity wards, the abuse in the maternity wards, statements from, I think, the Council of Europe saying there's a rhetoric, against the high birth rates of Roma. We are concerned that this was race-based, or that this was gender-based, that this was discriminatory, but the court refused to recognize that. So in terms of mechanisms, I think that was a question 20 minutes ago. In terms of mechanisms, the human rights tools have proved to be very limited, and human rights laws have proved to be very limited. And as Deborah was saying, also the way that the European Union and the system itself is constructed, where race and gender are sort of viewed as mutually exclusive, and there's gender mainstreaming but no parallel race mainstreaming, that has consistently served to marginalize Romani women and discrimination against Romani women and other women of color in Europe, in the European Court of Human Rights.
Could I add something? Yes, regarding virginity tests, and then I'll go on to other health-related things. Regarding virginity tests, women have resisted virginity tests in many creative ways, aside from legal means. I'm talking about under the table. I'm talking about chicken blood. I'm talking about getting your allies in the women who are examining the sheet so that they say what they see, even if they don't see what they see. There's many, many ways. And still today, women support each other in this. And in the communities of Macedonian Roma that I work with in the diaspora, this custom is going away. It is not happening as much. Women are becoming more educated. Some of them are becoming Islamicized and reading the Quran. Ironically, as they become more Muslim, they're realizing it is not in the Quran, and male religious leaders are supporting them. So there's lots of different ways to approach a problem. I think that's really important, that there have been creative ways. And Anissa's project was so interesting because it turned out that in the questionnaires, even the older generation didn't even support the practice. So that it was like going on without even civil support in the community. So that's why these studies are so important, to find out actually how people think. Regarding health discrimination, in Bulgaria today there are still segregated maternity wards in many places. In Macedonia, the NGO SOS Prilep that works with Roma, SOS Roma Prilep, has an entire health initiative that regards the unequal treatment by the entire health system of Macedonia toward Roma. Some really heartbreaking cases of botched surgeries. I don't want to get into the details. Another thing Macedonia has done, which I actually do not agree with, is that they fine parents for early marriage. They feel, and the SOS, one of the Roma NGOs supports this, but others may not, and we can talk about this later. I feel this could turn into racial profiling, that is, unduly singling out Roma for this practice, when actually it's done in other communities as well, but only Roma get prosecuted for early marriage. So we can talk about, again, what would be legal responses to something you want to eradicate.
Just to transform a little bit Magda's terms. I would, when highlighting issues of injustice, I would like better use the terms like deprivation, dispossession, exploitation, and not only discrimination. And in this sense, well, I am a socialist, anti-racist feminist, so no wonder that my discourse is framed in these terms. But it very nicely completes what you already put on the table. So we should also see how social and economic inequalities are having an impact differently on Roma women than Roma men. Besides being an academic and also a political activist for housing rights and housing justice in Romania, so we focus very much on how housing injustice affects Roma persons in the form of forced evictions, in the form of forced resettlements nearby toxic environments, like landfills, for example. We also focus on the lack of social and public housing, which pretty much is a cause of why low-income people, including Roma, are pushed out from the cities where are better resources for life, right? So because they cannot make a living to pay for life in these big cities where opportunities are. So basically what we do is together with women and men of Roma ethnicity who live in Cluj in a ghettoized area nearby the landfill. We make, for example, together this newspaper, which is called The Brick, magazine for housing justice. And this is the last issue of our magazine, which we published with the occasion of Women's International Day. So in this issue again reflects how we combine different perspectives and how we also use feminism to discuss about the structural deprivations, such as housing deprivation. And it is, well, in a way, also a matter of you know, how you manage to discuss, and this might be a question for the further debate, how we activists, regardless of our ethnicity and class, how we manage to discuss at the same time about gender, ethnic, and class inequalities and injustices. Is that possible, or it happens that sometimes you push forward one big issue and leave behind others, while not forgetting or while keeping in mind all the time that all these factors are playing a role in the way how a person's life opportunities are structured.
Yeah, thank you all very much. And I think it's so scary how the racecraft, if you want, if we are to use Barbara Field's framework, the racecraft of Romani criminality, Romani inferiority, but also the racecraft of Romani fertility have played an important role in the way that institutions and structures have been violent against our communities. And it's scary how the axis of power, right, would intersect in creating so much damage to our communities. But perhaps to get back to your point, Alex, about gender and race, and knowing that for decades now, perhaps very much like our African American sisters and like our Dalit sisters and Palestinian sisters, our Romani female activists and scholars have frequently felt that sexism is kind of insignificant in the light of harsher or more brutal reality of racism, as our dear Bell Hook would say. And also in the chapter, in one of the chapters of your book, Patricia Caro Maya talks about the construction of Calis as victims. Calis are Romani women from Spain, as victims of their backward culture, and it's equally present in some of the Gaja feminist discourse. So I guess the question that I have is, and it's more for you, Alex, how do Romani feminists demand and navigate and compromise and negotiate in relations to the barriers that come on one side from their white feminist fellows and on the other side from their Romani men fellows?
That's a good question. All I can say is that it reminds me of which I think it's been alluded to, the arranged marriage of Ana Maria Schwaba. So we had a 12-year-old Romani girl whose marriage was arranged in Romania. Her father often referred to himself as king of the gypsies, things like that. So, and it was a big public spectacle. And that was when I really saw this playing out. So how do you, as a Romani feminist, object to this 12-year-old girl, being taken from the dolls to the bedroom? I think her aunt, who was here in the U.S., was describing it, basically from the dolls to the bedroom. How do you object to that without falling into the trap of reifying these stereotypes about Roma as backward and having this primitive culture? And what you saw play out all over the newspapers was exactly that. There was this dichotomy where primitive Romani culture was, was placed against this progressive, non-Romani culture and human rights discourse and all of that. And they interviewed Romani NGOs who focused solely on race, and they said, this is untouchable Romani tradition. You cannot criticize this. That is racist. So any sort of critique of the practice was going to be framed as racism. And then you had I guess for lack of a better word, the racists who were saying this is primitive gypsies. They need to abide by the laws of Europe. They now live in Europe. We cannot help them if they're going to oppress their own people. And I'm sure that rhetoric sounds familiar to a lot of you. And so you had Romani women, Nicoletta Beets, for instance, who was criticizing the practice, not from the perspective of it being primitive or it being some backward culture, but saying, hey, this is patriarchal. Every culture has got patriarchy, and this is what ours looks like. This is what our patriarchy looks like. And there was indigenous resistance from the community, from a Romani woman, but she got no airtime. She got no coverage by the newspapers. And on top of that, her authenticity became questioned, right? So she wasn't a real Roma woman because she didn't abide by this practice or because she was willing to go out and criticize this practice. And it's something that we've heard over and over, right? One of my favorite quotes from a guy is, bear with me. My advice to you is not to divide Roma into women and men, gay and lesbian. Turn your attention to the global problem of the Roma. In the eyes of the Gaije, the non-Roma, in the eyes of the Gaije, you're not a girl or a woman, you're a gypsy. And so that's something, yeah, and so that we've all heard different iterations of that, I'm sure. From various sectors of our communities. And you have to start thinking, well, when so-and-so's mother is beat in her home, is she a gypsy first and not a woman? When a Romani woman is raped, is she a gypsy first? Coerced sterilization, that framework doesn't make sense, right? That primacy of race only doesn't make sense in a whole host of frameworks because Romani women experience intersectional subordination, exploitation, and brutality. So as far as having a solution, I don't. I know that the way I've tried to frame it to Roma when I've gone into communities and when I address the contact point for Roma and Sinti issues at the OSCE, there were some traditional Roma in the audience, and I didn't go in there saying, hey, this is, you know, the wrong thing to, I said, look, this is not acceptable. Now, you know that. But what's more, if you don't remedy this, they're going to send in the police, and they're going to remedy it for us. So either we all try to get on the same page and combat this practice, or it's going to happen regardless from the outside. So that was sort of a, I don't know whether it was right or wrong, but it was sort of a strategic way I thought about selling it to more traditional community members. They're going to come in here. They're going to fine you. They're going to, you know, lock you up. They're going to take your kids away. So let's work on this issue. So whether there's a right approach or not.
If I may add something to that, and to recall our memory about how this case was politically used in the process of Romania's accession into the European Union. I guess that's, again, an important aspect to mention. So how Roma, through that case, were associated with the bad things that are happening in Romania, blaming all the Romanian state that is not able to handle with this, or the Roma communities that they are primitive and backward. So it was always there, and this story continued later when the accession happened, and many people from Romania migrated abroad looking for a job. Like 4 or 5 million people are still abroad, Romanian, Hungarian, Roma, other ethnic minorities. And it is still the Roma, you know, who are associated with the Romanian poverty and threat that puts under pressure the so-called more civilized EU member states. So, yeah, I guess this is also important when we are talking about structural racism and how this is used also in the international relations and positionings.
Yeah, I just wanted to widen the argument, first of all, to the U.S., because this case of the 12-year-old getting married was featured in 17 magazine as, you know, an outrage. So it's the life of this story that serves a lot of political purposes. The tools of the oppressor want these stories for us to think that Roma culture is primitive. So this culturalization, I want to look at it a little bit more deeply. It's really interesting because Roma throughout, even in scholarship, have either been overdetermined by their culture or underdetermined. If we start with underdetermined, they've been accused of having no culture of their own. They're just sponges. They went from country to country and adopted the local culture, the local music, and so on, but they have no culture. So that's denying them their own identity, actually, okay? Or they're overdetermined, which means they're trapped in their culture, which is a very, very sophisticated argument and is used against other people too. I'd like to quote Mahmoud Mamdani, the Ugandan cultural political theorist, who said that he calls this culture talk, which is the predilection to define cultures according to essential characteristics, so trapped by your culture. But this denies that any culture itself has a history or is tied to politics or inequality or economic situation. Culture changes quite readily, as we can see from the 60s in my lifetime, okay? And actually, early marriage has lessened and died out in many communities. Early marriage was a characteristic of European society 100 years ago. So before you point fingers, you have to understand how these arguments are actually being used to demonize whole people. And if you look at culture, culture is a very organic type of thing. I mean, the stereotypes of Romani culture are the welfare mother, the mother of 8 children, the victim of sex trafficking, the victim of violence. All of this is denying any agency to women who have fought some of these things in really, really creative ways.
Coming from the response to structural violence question from a different angle, I'm just struck by the impossibility of separating gender and race analyses, and also the potential destructiveness of a race-blind approach. So when Alex was talking about coerced sterilization and the treatment of Romani women in hospitals, I was also reminded of a sort of classic feminist issue, domestic violence, and how there was a regional program for women advocates to respond to domestic violence, and Romani women's organizations were invited to join in this initiative and started to send Romani women in Macedonia specifically to their newly established domestic violence shelters where they were attacked racially. So that was a disaster. So again, we cannot, force Romani women's issues into a feminist framework, but also that the solutions to the macro problems of educational discrimination, health discrimination, housing discrimination, and employment have Romani women at the core of the solutions. So we also must look at Romani women's lives and roles in those big problems, which is why it's frustrating when major initiatives on those issues do not have a gender analysis. That's really what I wanted to say. Yes, please.
And I think it's important also to underline something that Carol mentioned, and this idea of the media, and especially the American media, that takes on board issues that they feel that would fit with the idea of the gypsies. So there were two stories that made it in the American media. One of them was the story of this young girl who went into this forced arranged marriage. And the other story is the story of Maria, a blonde girl who was kidnapped by the gypsies, according to the American and European media, only to learn a few days later that she was in fact Romani. It's just that she didn't look like her family. But yet, in the past few years, and I talked about this in my presentation at the annual Roma conference at Harvard, there were many young boys, girls who were killed by neo-Nazi groups, by vigilante groups in Europe, and none of them made it in the media. I haven't seen much about the stories of the three sisters in Italy 2 years ago. I think Federica, Elizabeth, and Angelica, they were aged 4, 8, and 20, who were burned alive. And they didn't make the news because they didn't fit the idea of the gypsies in the minds of journalists. And I think it's important to talk about the responsibility that the media has in that sense. But I'll take a few minutes now to take a couple of questions from the audience. And I kindly ask the panelists to repeat the question or to summarize it because we don't have wireless microphones. So I'll leave it to you now. Anyone would like to ask a question? Yes, please, in the back. Okay, I'll take two more questions and then I'll pass the floor to you to respond. Anyone else? Yes, please. Could you speak up? Yeah, I couldn't hear. About virginity test. Yeah, I can explain. Okay. One more question, if there is any. Okay, then let's answer to this question. Two questions. Who wants to go first? Carol? I'll go first. Yeah.
Well, there's quite a lot of debate in theory circles about how we can use the word colonization and decolonization. First of all, there's different kinds of colonization, and then there's the question of how might it apply to the Romani case and history, okay? So there's extractive colonization, where powers go and extract. There's also settler colonization. There's many different kinds. The way the way I look at it, I won't say we, because actually we haven't really discussed this, but we've used it in our work. The way I think of it is a kind of structural oppression, because Romani history is filled with, how can you say, various episodes of oppression that have particular contexts, historical attacks, and so on. But Roma are a South Asian group from India that entered the Balkans and the rest of Europe around 1200. And from the very beginning, maybe after a little bit of fascination with the exotic, they were excluded, evicted, deported, not allowed to study, to settle. And in various periods, they moved around. So we're not even sure if this whole idea of nomadism comes from some older layer, or if they were actually forced to be nomadic. So you can see levels of oppression from the very, very early on. But I mean, we're talking about systematic oppression, and we're talking about every level of empire and nation state and democracy also being oppressive to Roma. So I'm not sure what other word we could use. And to me, even though it's not the standard formula for colonization, it fits the model, but other people could certainly disagree. And about virginity, in the Balkans, the virginity test is basically that you've raised an honorable girl. So it's really important for the bride's family. It's their pride that they've done their job. And even the good news about her virginity is delivered from the groom's family to the bride's family. So basically, both sides are interested in the bride's virginity. But for centuries, women have not been virgins and have gone through these tests and figured out ways to live their lives in some way.
So I don't know the organizers, what their mind was about using the term decolonizing feminism. But I'm considering to think about decolonization generally as a process of emancipation of different oppressed groups, categories, and their emancipation from this desire, we may say, to be accepted by the oppressive society or oppressive part of the society. So if we speak about decolonizing feminism from an anti-racist perspective, I guess we have to be to focus on ways in which non-white, non-middle class feminists managed to frame their own perspective and to push this on the agenda of feminism. So to make themselves a place in the whole field of feminisms. If it were to think about decolonizing feminism from a socialist perspective, I would think about the need to decolonize people mindsets and impoverished people mindsets, in the sense to be aware about the structural causes of their impoverishment, and not to believe all the bullshit about their own personal so-called inabilities or incapacities to be otherwise than poor. So and this is where I see the role of feminist activists in all sorts of spheres of life, to support these processes within which are happening within the oppressed groups, and to be part of transforming these efforts into political messages based on trans-ethnic, transgender, trans-class solidarities.
You want to say something? Okay. So the way I viewed it was sort of a deviation from the way that feminism has been structured based on, well, it's white supremacist underpinnings. So the prototypical woman that feminism has revolved around has been a white middle or upper middle class white woman, and as first wave feminism, framed around the concerns of white women. So when I think of decolonizing feminism, I think of, Sojourner Truth, Ain't I a Woman? Sort of building the movement based on experiences of those on the bottom, a bottom-up type of analysis. And for instance, when white women were talking about rejecting chivalry and kind of don't hold the door, well, chivalry was never a word to black women. They never had that chivalrous treatment. Neither did Roma women, who were enslaved in the area now known as Romania. So that's what I think of, sort of restructuring who this prototypical, the prototypical white woman that the movement was based upon, at least in the beginning.
I will say that we're about to hear an incredibly fabulous panel looking at some of the similarities across movements of Roma women, Dalit women, Palestinian women, and just in thinking about the term decolonization, I think very literally as a historian of the fact that Romani women's activism in Central and Eastern Europe actually arose from a moment of transition from Soviet domination of the region, and that brought particularities out that constructed the experience of Romani women and Romani women's eventual activism. So Eniko mentioned before the kind of forced emancipation of Soviet life led many women to have what we called an allergic reaction to feminism, and also unleashed a very virulent anti-Roma racism that was kept in check in some ways by Soviet culture. So just a plea for kind of, as we're looking at the commonalities, to also pay attention to the historical specificities of each of these experiences. But it's going to be a fabulous panel.
And perhaps from the organizers' perspective, I would say that this whole panel discussion has been put together by Romani feminists and Black feminists. And I think that with Angela and Carlene, what we wanted to look at were similarities between movements, similarities between struggles, common tactics, ways in which we can support each other. And I think on both sides of this story, I think, if I may speak on behalf of Carlene and Angela as well, we felt that our stories often have been told by white feminists, and in a way that we didn't feel that we were part of, and this is one of the reasons why we put this whole conversation under the framework of decolonization of feminism. And perhaps if that question was more related to, to the origins of Romani women, I guess that the simple answer is no, we are not white women in Europe, and we are not perceived as such. And with that, I would like to thank our panelists. It's been overwhelming to sit beside you and to listen to your different perspectives and thoughts. I look forward to the second panel that will look more at solidarity among intersectional feminists, and I would pass the floor to Carlene to chair that panel. Thank you very much.